The rain had been falling since morning. A quiet, steady rain that turned the cobbles outside Selina Radham's window into a running mirror. And she had been listening to it without quite hearing it. Her pencil moving down the column of a household ledger she had already corrected twice. When she heard the hoofbeats. Not the iron clatter of the mail coach. Not the even trot of a hired hack. Something smaller and laboured. A pony moving at the full stretch of its legs through standing water. She set her pencil down and went to the window. The boy was perhaps 12, his hat brim a dark funnel of rain, the oilskin across his shoulders soaked through at the shoulders despite everything. He was squinting up at the number above the door with the frowning concentration of someone who has been told twice to get it right. And he dismounted and rang the bell before Selina had quite decided to move. Those 2 rented rooms on Arden Street were clean and decent, and not much else. Selina had lived in them for 3 years, long enough to know which floorboards sang at night and how to prop the sash window so the draught did not take the candle. But she had never made the mistake of thinking she belonged to them. The sitting room served as both parlour and workroom. Her account books were stacked in order of urgency along the window ledge, and the desk's 3rd leg was shimmed with a folded piece of cardboard that she had intended to replace for 6 months. Emily, her younger sister, looked up from the table where she sat with a length of green ribbon and a hat that had not been a success. She was 21, and pretty in the way of a girl whose prettiness had not yet been refined by difficulty, and she wore it with a cheerful confidence that Selina observed, with a complicated mixture of affection and concern. "Who is it?" Emily asked, already knowing from the quality of Selina's stillness that it was not Mr. Barlow, who sent notes rather than letters and would not have committed to wet weather. "A boy from the north," Selina said. "By his boots." The letter he handed up was sealed with a coronet, not a crest she placed at first, and the paper was the colour of old cream, thick enough that it had survived 3 days' travel without wicking through. She gave the boy 6pence and a towel, told the housemaid to find him something hot to drink, and carried the letter to the window, where the November light was failing but had not quite given out. The handwriting was what struck her first. Small, upright letters pressed hard into the page, the kind of hand that does not bother with flourishes because flourishes imply uncertainty. And the woman who had written this had never learned what uncertainty felt like in her fingers. Every word sat exactly where the writer had meant to put it. The Dowager Duchess of Elmsford required a person of competence and discretion. Her son's great house at South Tarn, she used the word great with no apparent irony, had been shut up for 10 years. Its library in a condition not worth describing, its accounts in a condition that did not bear examination. The present Duke was not a man who could be prevailed upon to manage his own affairs. And the Dowager, being 72 and disinclined to travel north in autumn, required someone who could. Selina's name had been furnished by a Mrs. Alderton of Bath, who reported only that Miss Radham possessed a head for figures, a tolerance for disorder, and no particular tendency to be frightened by either. The last line Selina read 3 times. "My son does not know I am writing to you. He will not thank me. Come anyway." She folded the letter along its original creases and set it on the windowsill. The coronet seal rested against the glass, a small impression in dark wax, the ducal crown, with its 5 points just distinct enough to count. "Well," said Emily, who had given up any pretence of the hat. "A position." Emily's face moved quickly through its stages. Interest, calculation, the particular softening that meant she had hoped for something more festive. "Not a house party." "A library, in Cumberland. The house has been shut up for some years and wants attention." Cumberland. Emily let the word settle in the room. She was not a stupid girl. She understood immediately that this was not Mrs. Alderton's drawing room in Bath. that there would be no assemblies, that the men she had been picturing on the drive north would not exist. "How very far?" she said, which was the gentlest possible form of an argument. Selina drafted her reply that same afternoon. She was not a woman who bargained out of habit, but she had learned early that an arrangement with its terms unspoken is not an arrangement. It is an ambush, waiting for its moment. She named her salary plainly, generous without being extravagant, specific enough to discourage negotiation. She asked for authority over the household commensurate with what was required, and for no interference from the dowager beyond what had been set down in writing. She sealed it with plain wax and sent it back with the boy, who was by then warm again and had eaten enough to be cheerful about the return journey. The fortnight that followed was ordinary in the way that fortnights are when you are waiting for something to be decided. Emily attended 2 dinner parties and came home from both with that particular flush of a girl who has been noticed more than she ought to have been. Selina corrected accounts for a solicitor on Henrietta Street and declined an invitation to Mrs. Poole's Tuesday card evening, which she had always found airless and loud. She told herself she had not thought much about South Tarn. This was approximately true, except for the one line she had read 3 times. A man who has fallen to ruin. Not the line about the library, which was her professional province. Not the line about the accounts, which was a problem she knew how to approach. That one. The way the dowager had written it without pity and without anger, only the flat, dry knowledge of a woman who has watched something she loved become something she could no longer protect and has had years to make her peace with the fact. The reply came on a Thursday. Same thick cream paper, same pressed down hand. Every term accepted, travelling expenses added without comment, and a postscript. I knew you would do. The ones who name their terms are the only ones worth having. Selina read the postscript twice. Then she began to make her lists. The journey north took the better part of 3 days, the country changing in the gradual way of country that is not performing its changes, but simply being them. Green fields became grey, the roads narrowed and roughened, the verges rising into banks of dead bracken, the sky dropping lower until it pressed against the hills with a comfortable familiarity. At the inn at Penrith, where she stopped the second night, the landlady built up the fire in her room without being asked, and brought her supper herself, rather than sending the girl. And these small acts of northern hospitality, performed without warmth or comment as simply the right way of doing things, told her more about the country she was entering than any description could have done. On the 3rd afternoon, the carriage descended through a gap in the fells, and Selina looked down into the long, still water of South Tarn for the first time. It was not what she had expected, and she had not arrived with strong expectations. The Tarn was dark, a metallic grey-black in the failing light, perfectly still except for one circle of disturbance where a bird had just left the surface. Above it on the eastern bank, the house stood with its back to the last of the sun. A long, heavy-shouldered building of pale stone, its shutters mottle-dark with lichen, its chimneys cold. 3 of the upper windows had their glass intact, 1 did not. The drive had been reclaimed at its edges, gravel swallowed by grass, and the woman waiting beside the servants' entrance held a lantern against her chest and had her free arm wrapped around herself against the cold, though the cold did not quite warrant it. Mrs. Peel, the housekeeper, had the look of someone who has been managing an emergency with insufficient resources for so long that emergency had simply become the prevailing weather of her days. She was gaunt and net-haired, her hands already moving to twist the corner of her apron as she received Selina, and she carried herself with the careful deference of a woman who has learned not to invest too much in new arrivals. The last 3 persons sent by her grace did not stay the week, she said, as she led Selina through the servants' entrance with a candle that guttered in the draught of the corridor. She offered this not precisely as a warning, more as a fact she considered someone ought to have. "What drove them off?" Selina asked. Mrs. Peel was silent for a moment, navigating a turn in the passage. "The house," she said at last. Selina asked to see the worst of it before she slept. The request produced a brief pause, and then a straightening of Mrs. Peel's already straight back. She took her through the ground floor by candlelight, through rooms under holland covers, the air in each one carrying the dense, mineral cold of spaces that have not been warm in years. A drawing room whose curtains had rotted along the bottom edge. A morning room whose ceiling plaster had come down in 2 neat sections, as though it had made an orderly decision about the matter. A dining room that was technically intact, and therefore somehow the most oppressive room in the house. The table set for 12, the china in place, the silver under a half-decade of dust. Everything arranged for a dinner that no one had ever come to. The library was at the end of the east corridor, and when Mrs. Peel pushed open the door, Selina stood in the entrance for a moment, without speaking. Even ruined, it was magnificent. 3 walls of shelving running floor to ceiling, a rolling ladder still on its brass rail, 2 long reading tables placed to catch the light from windows that faced the tarn. Between the tables stood a pair of library globes on mahogany stands, terrestrial and celestial, each the size of a child. At some point, water had come down through a cracked seal above the north window and found the terrestrial globe with patient, years-long persistence, splitting it along the meridian in a long, neat crack that ran from pole to pole, from the Arctic Circle to the Southern Sea. The books on the north wall were the worst. Spines warped, pages swollen into fans, some volumes pressed together by accumulated damp until they had ceased to be separate objects at all. She walked to the nearest shelf and drew one out, a quarto, its boards soft as felt, and it came away from its neighbours with a sound she did not like. A sound like something tearing that did not want to tear. "Leave it," said a voice from the far end of the room. "There is no one to read them." She had not seen him. The reading chair had been placed, deliberately, she understood at once, with its back to the window, so that whoever sat in it was in shadow while the doorway and the woman standing in it were in the light. He had known she was coming. He had come to the library to look at her before she could look at him. He was tall and spare in the way of a man kept too long from occupation, and he wore a dark coat that made him part of the shadows before she had quite adjusted her eyes for the far end of the room. He had his left side angled slightly away, not aggressively, not with the studied casualness of a man trying to seem unaware of what he is doing, but with the practiced economy of a man who has spent so many years making that small adjustment that it had stopped requiring thought. She saw the scar when the candle Mrs. Peel held shifted in a draught. A long, clean line down the left side of his face, from the outer corner of his eye to the angle of his jaw. Well healed, the tissue paler than the surrounding skin, pulling his expression very slightly towards something that might have been a permanent weariness in another man, but in him read simply as a severity that the rest of his face did not quite earn. He was watching her with the fixed attention of someone waiting to be obeyed. Selina set the damaged book down on the shelf, not carefully replaced since it was past careful replacement, but laid flat to prevent further harm, and turned to face him. "I will not leave it," she said. "At least, not until I have established which of them can be saved. Throwing good books away because bad ones cannot be helped would be precisely the wrong lesson to take from this room." A silence. The candle flame steadied and the shadows settled. "You are the woman my mother sent." It was not a question. "Miss Radham," she said, "your mother engaged me to put your library in order and your accounts in something approaching sense. I arrived this evening and asked Mrs. Peel to show me the worst of it. This," she indicated the north wall with a slight motion of her head, "is apparently the worst of it." "Apparently," he said, and the word carried a weight she did not fully pass yet. She was looking at him steadily, Not staring, not performing composure, simply looking in the direct way she had learned early was more useful than any other approach when meeting a new employer. She said, "The scar is from a cavalry sabre. The stitching was good work." She saw his jaw tighten. "The worst of it," she continued, and her voice was even and matter-of-fact, "is not the wound itself. I would think it is the way no one who knows you speaks of it, which means you are always aware of it and never permitted to set it down." The Duke was still for a long moment. The fire in the grate, the only fire she had seen burning in the house, snapped once. Outside the uncurtained window, the tarn was invisible in the dark, only the faintest pale reflection moving where the water met the last light. "No one has said that to me," he said finally, "in 10 years. "Then everyone you know is a coward," Selina said, "or too kind, which comes to the same thing in the end." He did not respond to that. He looked at her with the expression of a man who has been handed something he had no expectation of receiving and does not yet know what to do with the weight of it. Then he rose, he was taller standing than she had estimated, and left the library without another word. His boots were quiet on the flagged floor of the corridor, and then he was gone, and Mrs. Peel let out a long, slow breath she had been holding since Selina pulled the book from the shelf. "He didn't send you away," Mrs. Peel said, which seemed to be the standard by which the evening was measured. Selina looked at the globe on its mahogany stand, the long crack running from pole to pole. "No," she agreed. "He didn't. Now, where have you been storing the estate ledgers?" By the end of her first week, Selina had catalogued the damage in the library, with enough precision to know what order to work in, had identified 2 substantial patches of active damp that required immediate attention, beyond braziers and aired air, and had drawn up a schedule for every person in the household whose time was not already accounted for, which, in a house that had been running at approximately a third of its necessary complement, was nearly everyone. The braziers were her first practical imposition. She placed 6 of them along the north wall, at intervals she calculated by the floor area and the rate at which the winter air moved through the gap under the skirting board. Not guesswork, not tradition, but the application of a method she had developed working with a solicitor's damp-damaged archive in Bristol 3 years before. The heat was not excessive. It was steady, which was the point. Books that have been cold and wet do not benefit from being made suddenly warm and dry. They benefit from the gradual removal of the conditions that are killing them, applied with patience. The maids, 3 of them, young women who had been performing their duties in the absent-minded way of people uncertain whether their work mattered, took to the library within 2 days. Selina showed them once how to lift a damaged binding without pressure on the spine, how to open a swollen volume only so far as it chose to open and no further, how to lay books flat on the long table in the configuration she called little tents, open gently at their natural spread, allowed to breathe. She did not explain the reasoning at length. She demonstrated, watched them replicate it, corrected the small errors without ceremony, and moved on. By the 3rd day they were working without supervision and doing it correctly. The girl who attached herself to the account work was named Alice, not a housemaid by training but by circumstance, a farmer's daughter from the valley who had come to the house at 16 and stayed because the alternatives were fewer. She was 20 now, with the square hands and the watchful economy of movement that comes from a childhood of actual labour. And she had been taught to read by the previous housekeeper, a woman who had apparently believed literacy was not a luxury. Alice did not ask to help with the ledgers. She positioned herself within sightline of the desk where Selina worked, performed her own duties with ostentatious conscientiousness, and waited. Selina noticed on the 2nd day. On the 3rd, she said, without looking up from the column she was adding, "Can you keep a running total in your head while you're doing something else?" "Yes, miss," said Alice. "Sit down, then." That was how it began. The ledgers themselves were, at first examination, merely neglected, the standard consequence of a decade of absence. Figures unreconciled, rents not entered, repairs listed without their costs, tenants identified only by the plots they occupied rather than their names. This was disorganisation, which Selina could remedy. It was on the fourth day, when she had laid 3 years of accounts side by side and was working backwards from the most recent entries, that she found the first inconsistency. A timber sale. 19 mature oaks from the east fell, entered in April of 1812 at a price that bore no relationship to the price timber had commanded in that year. She knew the price. She had worked for a Cumbrian landowner 6 years before and had negotiated 2 such sales herself. The discrepancy was not arithmetic error. Arithmetic error does not produce a figure consistently and precisely lower than accurate market value across 7 transactions over 4 years, always rounded in the same direction, always credited to the same party. She worked until the candles had burned down twice, and Alice sat across from her and did not ask to go to bed. And by the time Selina set her pencil down, the picture was complete. Thomas Grieve, the estate agent, had been selling timber, letting farms stand empty while collecting what he reported as operating costs and recording rental income at a fraction of what the tenants were actually paying. The mechanism was neat. He had relied, correctly, on a duke who did not wish to engage with the world and had given him authority without oversight, and on a series of housekeepers who either did not know what they were looking at or had concluded that pointing it out was outside their remit. The sum was considerable. Selina looked at it for a moment, then turned to Alice. "Does anyone in this house know about this?" Alice's expression was the careful neutrality of someone who knows a great deal and has learned to be cautious about who receives the benefit of that knowledge. "Mrs. Peel suspected," she said. "She didn't have the figures." "She will now," said Selina. "Tomorrow morning, I will need a word with the Duke." Alice said nothing, but her hands, which had been quite still on the table, moved to straighten a stack of papers that did not need straightening. "He will not be pleased," Alice said. "No," said Selina. "That is not the point." She placed the papers before him in the library the following morning. Not arranged for ease, but arranged for truth, which meant the worst of it was at the top, in the simplest possible terms. The total taken over 4 years, the number of farms currently empty, the number of tenants who had been paying into a pocket that was not his. She waited while he read. The Duke's face did not move much while he read. He had the quality, which she had observed in very few people, of being able to receive bad news without distributing the experience of receiving it to everyone in his vicinity. He turned the pages with the steady attention of a man who has decided to understand a thing before responding to it, and when he reached the last page, he set it down and was quiet for a moment, with his hands flat on the table. "How long have you known?" he said. "Since 2 o'clock this morning." He looked up at that. Whatever he had been expecting, it was not her having worked through the night. "Grieve must go," Selina said. "But before he does, I need you to ride out with me. The farms are your concern, not mine. I can put numbers on a page, but I cannot look a tenant in the face and speak for you. The land has been without its owner for 10 years. The land has missed you." A silence, in which you let the silence do its work. "That is not a thing land does," the Duke said. "Isn't it?" Selina said. "Ride with me tomorrow and see." He argued in the way of a man who argues not because he expects to win, but because the habit of resistance is what has kept him in one place for a decade. She did not yield and did not repeat herself. She simply waited, and by the end of the morning, it was agreed. The following day was clear and cold, the kind of early winter morning in the north that lays everything out with a precise and remorseless clarity. No softening light, no haze, just the grey-white sky and the long, pale grass of the valley floor, and the distances very sharp and far. They rode without conversation for the first mile, the Duke on a bay horse that had grown fat with inactivity and was glad of the movement. Selina on the mare Mrs. Peel had located in the home stable, a steady creature with a sensible eye. The first farm was Sowerby's. It sat in the fold of the western hill, its walls sound, its kitchen garden laid out in winter tidiness. A man who kept things in order, even without cause for hope. The tenant came out into the yard as they rode in, wiping his hands on a cloth, squinting against the pale sky. He was perhaps 60, with a face that had been resolute for so long that the lines of resolution had become permanent. And he looked at the Duke with the brief blankness of a man who recognises a face from long ago and is rearranging time around the recognition. "Your Grace," he said, with a formality that held more weight than ceremony. The weight of a man who has addressed an absentee landlord only in his own head for years, and is now confronted with the fact that the conversation will have to be conducted in the open air. Selina watched the Duke's face as Sowerby spoke. She had asked about the barn roof in the accounts. It appeared in Greaves' ledger as repaired in June of 1810 at a cost of 14 shillings for labour and materials, a sum that had been drawn from estate funds and delivered nowhere. When she asked Sowerby about it, the old man's face changed in the small, specific way of a person who has carried a practical grievance for so long that the grievance has become part of the ordinary texture of his days. And its sudden acknowledgement is almost more disorienting than the grievance itself. The roof had not been repaired in 1810. It had been repaired by Sowerby himself in 1812 with his own timber and a son-in-law's labour, because the alternative was to lose the autumn hay. The Duke looked at the barn. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I will send slates before the month is out. The whole of it, not the patch." They rode on. At 3 more farms, the story was essentially the same, not identical in detail, but identical in structure. A thing left undone. A man or woman who had done it themselves or gone without because the alternative was to wait for someone who was not coming. A statement of repairs promised, and now, against all reasonable expectation, being actually made. At each farm, the Duke listened with the same focused attention he had brought to the account papers. Not performing engagement, not offering the reassuring noise of a man who wants the conversation to end quickly, but actually attending to what was said. At the 4th farm, a fence line near the lane had lost 2 posts to the last hard frost, and the gate hung at an angle that made it impassable. The tenant's boy, 15, trying to wrestle it straight by himself, looked up as they rode in with the expression of someone caught in an admission of inadequacy. The Duke dismounted before Selina could speak. He handed his reins to the boy, took hold of the gatepost with both hands, and examined the hinge in the practiced way of a man who has mended gates before and understands the mechanical logic of the problem. He spoke to the boy. She could not hear what he said, and the 2 of them worked at it together for several minutes. The Duke's coat collar turned up against the cold, his breath visible in the air, his hands steady and unhurried on the frozen iron. The gate swung true. The Duke latched it, nodded once to the boy, and walked back to his horse. He did not say anything. He mounted and they rode back toward the house, and Selina rode beside him and did not say anything either, because there was nothing to say that the afternoon had not already said better. That evening the Duke took his tray in the old wing as usual. Mrs. Peel told Selina this with the slight emphasis of someone reporting the continuation of an established fact, and Selina nodded and went back to the library, where the fire had been banked well, and the books on the north wall smelled, for the first time, of something other than slow dissolution. She worked until the clock on the mantel said 9. At 9:30 she heard him in the corridor, the particular quality of a man who is moving quietly because he is uncertain of his welcome, rather than because the hour requires it. The door opened. The Duke came in and took the chair by the fire without speaking, his long legs extended toward the warmth, and Selina did not look up from the volume she was examining. After a while, he picked up a pamphlet from the nearest table, a natural history survey of the Northern Fells, intact, from 1791, and turned it over in his hands. He did not read it. She did not ask him to leave. He stayed until she closed the last volume, banked the fire, and said goodnight. He said goodnight in return. She went up the back stairs with her candle, and behind her she heard his tread on the flagged floor, slow and unhurried, returning to the old wing. He came back the next evening, and the one after. The thought that came to him, though he did not examine it that night, pushing it to the far corner of the room where the shadows gathered, was the thought of what time it was when she finally rose and went up, and that he had been, without any decision to that effect, waiting for it. What to make of that he did not yet know. What he knew was the warmth of the room, and the sound of her pencil, and that the house had been full of silence for 10 years, and the silence had at last changed its quality, and he was not yet ready to name the difference between the two silences, or ask himself which one he wanted to live in for the rest of his life. The mornings had a different quality by the 4th week. Not warmth, the valley held its cold well into December. The tarn sealed most mornings with a thin rime that the afternoon sun broke without quite defeating. But a quality of occupation, of rooms used again for the purposes they had been built for. The smell of the house was changing. Selina noticed it first in the entrance hall, the mineral, dark smell of closed stone, giving way to something with wood smoke and damp wool in it. The smell of a house with people moving through it, rather than around it. The vicar came on a Tuesday. His name was Reverend Sumner, a small, thin man in late middle age, whose overcoat had been resold so many times that the original leather existed only in theory, and who arrived at the house on a grey horse, with the specific expression of a man who has rehearsed his argument during a long ride and is now uncertain whether his argument was ever as good as he had believed. He left his card with Alice, who brought it to Selina in the library, with the slightly elevated eyebrows of a woman transmitting information she has not been asked to transmit. Selina read the card and set it on the accounts desk. The Reverend Sumner's roof had appeared in the estate ledgers under the heading of charitable obligations. The living at South Tarn Village was a crown living, but the manor had historically contributed to the upkeep of the church fabric, and the most recent entry, 4 years old, recorded a sum given toward the transept wall that was, Selina had already established, another of Greaves' fictions. The transept wall had received nothing. Neither had the roof. She went to find the Duke. He was in the old wing, in the room he used as a study. Not a pleasant room, austere in the way of rooms chosen for their defensibility rather than their qualities, with a single north-facing window and shelves that held ledger files rather than books, and a desk that contained, she was fairly certain, the letter he had never sent. She had seen him look at the top drawer on 2 occasions, with the exact expression of a man who knows an account is outstanding and has decided not to open the ledger. "Reverend Sumner has called," she said from the door. "He will have come about the roof." "Tell him," the Duke began. "I will tell him nothing," Selina said pleasantly. "He has ridden 4 miles in the cold to see the man whose family has supported his church for 90 years. You will receive him, ask about the roof, and agree to inspect it. The whole conversation need not last more than 20 minutes. A silence, of the kind she had learnt to read. Not resistance. Something closer to a man assessing whether the effort required is less than the cost of the alternative. He will look at the scar, the Duke said. He will glance at it once, remember his manners, and never look again, Selina said. He is a vicar. Tact is professional equipment. The Duke received Reverend Sumner in the library. Selina's choice, since it was the warmest room in the house, and the sight of the restoration work gave the conversation somewhere useful to go besides the obvious. She arranged for tea, and withdrew to the window alcove with the excuse of a shelf inventory, which was genuine enough to pass. She did not pretend to herself that she was not listening. Reverend Sumner was nervous for perhaps the first 3 minutes. Then the Duke asked without ceremony about the transept wall, and the vicar's voice changed. It became the voice of a man describing a practical problem he understands completely, and the relief of that specificity unlocked something. He produced, from an inner pocket, a fold of paper on which he had sketched the affected section of the roof in confident, practiced lines. A man who has been looking at a problem long enough to have developed strong opinions about the solution. The Duke leaned over the drawing. Selina heard him ask about the pattern of the water ingress, and Sumner's response was detailed and exact, and she heard, briefly, unmistakably, a single laugh from the Duke, prompted by some observation of the vicar's about the precise and vengeful efficiency of rainwater, which finds the one gap in 12 yards of sound lead and commits to it entirely. It was a short laugh, low, not performed for anyone. She kept her eyes on the shelf inventory. Afterward, when Sumner had left and the hoofbeats had faded down the drive, she found the Duke still standing with the vicar's sketch in his hands. He looked up when she came in and said, with the slight gruffness of a man who doesn't want to admit he has been persuaded, "The lead will want replacing on the east face as well, not only the section he marked." "I'll put it in the accounts," Selina said. He nodded. He folded the sketch and set it on the mantel. Not carelessly, but with the deliberateness of something to be returned to. He was colder the next morning than he had been in a week. She did not discover this in any single conversation. She discovered it in the way Mrs. Peel knocked on the library door at 9:30 with the particular careful face she wore when she was delivering a message she did not agree with. The Duke's compliments. Miss Radham was, of course, at liberty to continue with the library, and he was grateful for her work on the accounts. However, he felt her scope of activity might appropriately be confined to the East Wing for the present. Mrs. Peel delivered this without inflection. Selina received it the same way. "Thank you, Mrs. Peel," she said. "That will be all." She sat for a moment with her pencil between her fingers, looking at nothing in particular. Then she drew a sheet of paper toward her and wrote a note. Her handwriting was not the pressed-down severity of the dowagers. It was smaller and faster, the writing of a person who uses paper as a tool rather than a declaration. The note was 2 sentences. She asked Mrs. Peel to have it delivered. The first sentence confirmed that she would confine herself entirely to the East Wing, as requested, and would not presume to extend her work to any other part of the house. The second sentence observed, in the same tone, that the small south parlour on the ground floor had a windowsill in the lower sash that was directing water into the wall cavity, and that the damage would become irreversible within the month if unaddressed, which was, of course, not her concern, since she had been asked to restrict her attention. She went back to work. At 4 o'clock, the Duke appeared at the library door. He had the look of a man who has spent several hours losing an argument with himself and has arrived at the door directly from the final engagement. He said that she should feel at liberty to see to the south parlour and the morning room. She could exercise her judgment about the rest. "Thank you," Selina said, and did not raise her eyes from the volume she was examining. He stood in the doorway for a moment longer than the exchange required, and then he left. She heard his steps go down the corridor, unhurried, and then a door, and then nothing. She set down the volume and looked at the fire for a moment. Mrs. Peel, who had been pretending to straighten the bookmarks on the adjacent table, allowed herself a brief expression of profound satisfaction. Nan arrived on a Thursday afternoon in the second week of December, through the gate of the walled kitchen garden. She was Sowerby's granddaughter, not the Sowerby of the first farm visit, but his youngest son's girl. A small person of approximately 6 years, with straw-coloured hair escaping from a plait that had been done carefully earlier in the day and had since arrived at its own conclusions. She had walked 2 miles from her father's farm alone because, as she later explained to Selina, without apparent awareness that this required explanation, she had wanted to see the big house. The gate had been unlocked, which she took as an invitation. She found the Duke in the kitchen garden, where he had taken to walking in the late afternoon. Another thing that had begun without ceremony. The slow reclamation of his own land by the incremental method of putting himself in it. Selina, crossing from the east wing toward the main house with an armful of account books, caught the scene through the library window without intending to, and stopped. Nan had planted herself directly in front of the Duke and was looking up at him with the focused attention of a child conducting an unashamed examination. The Duke had gone still, in the way of large animals that have learned not to make sudden movements around small ones. Nan said something. He crouched, the long, considered crouch of a tall man getting down to a child's level. And she could not hear the words, only see his face change as he listened. Nan pulled up the hem of her skirt and showed him a scar on her knee, brown and well-healed, a small moon of raised tissue. She seemed to be explaining its origin with considerable satisfaction. The Duke looked at it with the gravity it deserved. Then he said something and tilted his own face slightly toward her, and Nan leaned in and looked at his scar with the same impartial scientific interest she had brought to her own, and said something that made her gesture along its line with her small finger not touching. He answered. Whatever he said, it made Nan nod, the satisfied nod of a child who has confirmed a hypothesis. Then she spotted the lamb. It had got in through a gap in the kitchen garden wall, a 3-month wether that had been the subject of mild shepherding concern for 2 days, and it was now standing in the corner of the garden, inspecting the remains of the winter brassicas with the blank determination of an animal that does not have opinions about property boundaries. Nan abandoned the Duke without ceremony and went straight for it. The lamb, which had not expected this, made the error of running directly toward the Duke, who moved, quickly, instinctively, without thinking about it, to cut it off with both arms. They caught it together between them, Nan seizing it around the neck with great commitment, the Duke getting a hand on its rump before it could double back, and for a moment the three of them were a single, ungainly arrangement of person and animal in the corner of the walled garden. Then the lamb subsided, Nan crowed, and the Duke looked down at the top of her head with an expression Selina could not name from the window, something that had nothing guarded in it. She stepped back from the window. She had a precise and inconvenient understanding of what she had just seen in herself. Not an observation, but a recognition. The account books in her arms were solid and heavy and real, and she was grateful for the weight of them. The lambing crisis came the following week. Kit, the shepherd's boy, 14 and conscientious, responsible for the home flock since the under-shepherd had gone at Christmas and not been replaced, appeared at the kitchen door at 9:30 in the evening, in a state of white-faced, controlled alarm that Selina recognised at once as the state of a person who has identified a serious problem and has come to the right place with it. A ewe had been down since sunset in the home pasture stable. 2 lambs. The first had not come right. He had tried for an hour. Selina sent Alice for lanterns before Kit had finished the sentence. She was already pulling on her outdoor coat, and she said, as she passed through the kitchen, "Tell Mrs. Peel to put water on and get rags from the press." She did not go to find the Duke. She was already through the door and into the cold dark. Kit ahead of her with the lantern swinging, and the pasture was 100 yards of wet grass between the house and the stable yard. She heard the second set of footsteps behind her when she was halfway across the field. He said nothing, and she said nothing, and they went into the stable together, where the ewe lay in the deep straw with the large pupilled exhaustion of a creature that has been working very hard for a long time without result. The first lamb was presented wrong. Selina had dealt with this once, 2 years before, at a farm in Westmoreland, where she had been visiting and the shepherd had been unavailable. She knew the principle, but her hands were not trained, and she said so plainly. The Duke knelt in the straw and said, equally plainly, "I know how." He knew how. He had the unhurried focus of a man not performing competence, but applying it. The quiet directions he gave to Kit, short and exact, and Selina held the lantern where he needed the light and watched his hands, patient, steady, operating in the limited space the situation provided, with a practiced economy she recognised from the gate mending, from the way he had caught the lamb in the kitchen garden. The hands of a man who had known how to be useful before the war and had not forgotten it, who had only forgotten that the knowledge was still in him. The first lamb came into the world just before 10. It lay a moment inert, and Kit made a small sound, and the Duke worked at it, brisk, specific movements, the straw, the breath, and then it moved, and then it was breathing, and then it was bleating. A thin, urgent sound that the ewe answered immediately and completely. The second lamb came in its own time, without difficulty, and by 10:30, both animals were upright, butting against the ewe with the unsentimental persistence of small creatures for whom survival is the first and only priority. The Duke sat back on his heels. The lantern threw a warm, unsteady light across the straw and the animals and his coat sleeves, which were dark past the elbows. He looked at the two lambs and did not say anything. His face, in the lantern light, had lost whatever it held when he was managing himself. Not the studied blankness of the library chair, not the careful severity of a man composed for visitors. Something that had been compressed for 10 years, folded tightly against itself, had briefly released. Kit, red-faced with relief and cold, said, "Thank you, Your Grace," with a formality that the straw and the blood and the occasion made purely touching. And the Duke said, "Well done yourself, Kit," which produced in the boy the expression of a person being handed something he had not known he needed. They walked back through the wet dark together, the house lit at the kitchen windows, their breath visible in the cold air. At the door, she handed him a lamp, and he took it, and their hands occupied the same space for a moment in the transfer. Inside, he cleaned up in the kitchen without self-consciousness, sleeves rolled, while Selina made tea from the pot Mrs. Peel had left. Alice had gone up. The kitchen had the settled warmth of a room that has been used all evening and is now in its last stage of quiet. He said, when she set the cup in front of him, "Don't go." Not the urgency of a man making a demand, the tone of a man who has said something he had not decided to say, and who is not retreating from it. Selina was quiet for a moment, her hands around her own cup. "I will not stay because I am needed here," she said at last. "I will not stay out of duty to the work, or out of obligation to your mother. Those are not reasons I would consider." He watched her. "What reasons would you consider?" She looked back at him across the kitchen table in the last warmth of the banked range and did not answer. The question remained in the room like the heat, present, real, and belonging to neither of them alone. The question did not dissolve in the cold of the following morning. Selina went up to bed, having given no answer, and the Duke went back to the old wing with the lamp she had handed him, and neither of them referred to it again directly. But the kitchen table had acquired a quality it had not possessed before, and they both knew it, and the knowledge sat in the house with the same patient permanence as the warmth in the library walls. The days that followed had a charged domesticity to them. The work continued, as work does, without regard for the interior weather of the people conducting it. The north wall of the library had responded well to the sustained heat of the braziers. The worst affected volumes were no longer losing ground, which was not the same as recovering it, but Selina had learned early in her professional life not to mistake the cessation of damage for the beginning of repair. She recorded what could be saved, what could not, and what was indeterminate and would require watching. Alice had by now so thoroughly absorbed the logic of the estate accounts that she could run 2 columns simultaneously in her head while transcribing a third. A capacity Selina noted and filed away without comment, because the time for that particular comment had not yet arrived. The Duke came to the library each evening. He did not always read, and he did not always speak. Sometimes he worked at his own correspondence, the correspondence that had begun to accumulate again now that he had shown the world, by the evidence of repaired fences and kept promises about slates, that there was a person present at South Tarn to receive it. The room had developed the particular settled quality of 2 people who have shared a space long enough to have ceased performing their ease and begun actually inhabiting it. The fire burned well. The crack in the globe's meridian caught the light at the same angle every evening. A small, reliable geography of damage. The letter arrived from Aldous Sarn on the 15th of January. Selina did not see it. Mrs. Peel brought it to the Duke in the old wing study. And the Duke said nothing to Selina about it, that day or the next. She learned of the visit only when Mrs. Peel appeared at the library door on the Thursday morning with her apron corner already moving, to announce that Mr. Sarnay would be arriving before dinner. Selina looked up from the ledger. "How long has the Duke known?" Mrs. Peel's hands stilled. "Since Monday, miss." 3 days. She considered this briefly, what it meant that he had said nothing, what it meant that Sarnay was coming at all, and said only, "We will need the dining room made ready. The good cloth, not the summer one. And tell Alice to look over the silver." What she knew of Aldous Sarnay, she knew from the estate records and from a single passing reference Mrs. Peel had made weeks earlier. The name offered with the flat economy of a woman who has opinions she has learned not to volunteer. He was the Duke's first cousin, heir presumptive to the title and to the encumbered estate. Encumbered because, Selina had understood for some time, the debts Grieve had obscured were not the only debts, and an estate without a direct heir was an estate with a future already spoken for by someone waiting at a polite distance. He had been waiting for 10 years. He arrived in a well-sprung travelling chaise with his own man and 2 trunks, which for a single night's visit was a quantity of luggage that told its own story. He was 40, fine-featured and fashionable. His coat the work of a London tailor, with strong opinions about lapels. And he greeted the Duke in the entrance hall with an embrace that was entirely correct and revealed nothing. The embrace of a man who has spent years maintaining the form of family warmth and has become very good at it. He looked at Selina with the pleasant, assessing attention of a man who has been told certain facts and is now verifying them. "Miss Radham," he said, "my cousin writes that you have performed miracles with the library." "The library has performed most of its own recovery," Selina said. "I've only removed the obstacles." He smiled. It was a good smile, practiced without being insincere. The smile of a man whose social intelligence is genuine, even when his purposes are not. At dinner, the dining room was warm for the first time in years. The silver recovered to a serviceable brightness by Alice's efforts. The candles in the 3-branched epergne at the table centre, throwing a light that made the room look inhabited again, rather than exhibited. Sarnay was at his best in candlelight. He had the kind of face that had been everywhere worth being seen and had learned to occupy the centre of a room as though the room had been arranged for it. He talked about London, who was where, what was being said, the small adjustments of precedence and fashion that constitute the intelligence of a certain kind of society. The Duke listened with the neutral attention of a man hearing news from a country he has not visited in years and is not certain he intends to revisit. Then Sane turned the conversation, with a grace that might have been mistaken for casualness, toward the past. He spoke about a ball, the Alderton ball, the summer before Spain, before the regiment sailed. He recalled how fine the Duke had been that night, how the room had watched him. He reached for a particular anecdote about a waltz, and then, in the act of telling it, glanced toward the portrait that hung at the far end of the dining room. It was a painting Selina had noted on her first tour of the house, the Duke at perhaps 25, in dress uniform, his posture the easy confidence of a man who has not yet learned what a thing can cost. Sane let his eyes rest on it for a moment that was precisely 1 moment too long, and then looked back at the living man across the table with the expression of someone performing the private arithmetic of before and after. "Of course," he said pleasantly, "a man in your position must give some thought to what is suitable. The succession, in particular. It has been a concern of mine, as a family matter, nothing more." The Duke was quite still. "You came," Selina said, "because you heard that a woman had arrived at South Tarn, and that the house was being put back together, and that the Duke had been seen to laugh." She set her wineglass down carefully. She did not raise her voice. "You have spent the evening reminding your cousin of everything the war cost him, and drawing his attention to a portrait of a younger man rather than the man across the table, because it serves your purpose for him to feel diminished. You were not here out of concern for the succession. You were here because you were afraid he might marry and produce an heir before the estate came to you, and you thought a visit might slow the possibility." Sane's expression did not change, which itself was information. He was not a man who was easily surprised, and he was not surprised now, only recalibrating. "Miss Radham," he said, with the measured amusement of a man who considers equanimity a point of pride, "you are very direct. I have nursed better men than you through worse things than disappointment," Selina said, "and I know the difference between concern and appetite. The difference is that concern asks what it can give, appetite asks what there is to be taken." The silence that followed was the kind that clears a room of its social weather and leaves only the essential topography. Sane left in the morning, before breakfast. His trunks were loaded with the efficient speed of a well-practiced man. The chaise turned in the drive, and the sound of the wheels on the frost-hardened gravel diminished and was gone. Mrs. Peel watched from the window of the servants' corridor, her face expressing nothing she had not already expressed. That evening, the Duke did not come to the library at his usual hour. Selina worked on until 9:30, and then sat for a while by the fire with the natural history survey of the Northern Fells that she had pulled from the shelf on her second week and had been reading in fragments ever since. It was a good book, careful, specific, written by a man who found the Fells beautiful in the way of someone who has walked them in all weathers and has not needed to exaggerate anything. He came at 10. He had not changed his coat from dinner, and he did not take his usual chair by the fire. He stood near the window for a moment, his back to the room, and then he went to the desk in the corner, the desk Selina used for the accounts, and opened the top drawer. Selina had known the drawer was significant. She had known it since the second week, when she had gone to that desk for a fresh ledger and had felt the resistance of a drawer that had been opened very rarely and had left it closed. He took out a letter. Not the dowager's thick cream paper, something thinner, older, the folds softened with years of folding and unfolding, the direction written in his own hand. He set it on the desk without unfolding it. Then he reached into the inner breast pocket of his coat and placed, beside the letter, a watch. Silver, the case worn to a polish at its edges from years of handling, the chain unfastened. He had kept it on his person. She understood, in the moment she saw it, that he had never stopped carrying it. She waited. His name was Thomas Timms, the Duke said. He was 19. He had been with the regiment 14 months. He was looking at the watch, not at her. He was beside me when the French counterattacked at Salamanca. I had perhaps 4 seconds more warning than he did. The angle of the ridge, the sound carrying differently. I turned. He had not turned yet. He stopped. The sabre was intended for me. The fire settled with a small sound in the grate. He died in the field station 3 hours later. He was conscious for most of it. He asked me to write to his mother. His voice was level, careful. The voice of a man who has rehearsed a thing so many times that the rehearsal has become a form of self-punishment rather than preparation. He told me she kept house for a clergyman in Shropshire. He told me to tell her he wasn't afraid. He paused. He was afraid. But by the time he said it, it wasn't true anymore. He had passed it. He sat down, not in his usual chair, but on the chair at the desk, his elbows on the wood, his face in his hands for a moment, and then his hands coming away and resting flat on either side of the watch. I wrote the letter in September of 1812, he said. I wrote it and addressed it, and then I came back to it 6 months later and could not send it. Because to send it was to tell her that her son was dead, and I was alive, by 4 seconds and the slope of a ridge. And I did not know how to ask her to receive that as anything other than what it was. Selina had been still throughout this. She was still now. She let the silence hold for a moment after he finished. You have spent 10 years, she said at last, punishing yourself for the crime of surviving. You understand that, not as an observation, but as the actual mechanism of what has happened in this house, and to this estate, and to your tenants, and to you. The dark wing, the shut rooms, the decade of absence. You sat in judgment on yourself and passed a sentence of isolation, and you have been serving it ever since. She paused. It is easier to sit in the dark than to stand in front of a grieving mother. I understand that. But you are not a coward, Dominic. You have never been a coward. And it is long past time you did the harder thing. His name, spoken plainly in her voice, fell into the room like a stone into still water. He looked at her. He had the expression of a man who has just heard something he has needed to hear for longer than he has been aware of needing it. And the hearing of it has not made it smaller, but larger. The full size of the thing, at last, without the distortion of 10 years' avoidance. Her son was brave, Selina said. You know that. You were there. Go and tell her. He went south in the 3rd week of January. The house in his absence was not the house it had been when Selina arrived. That house had been sealed against life, its emptiness a policy. This house was simply a house, with its owner temporarily away. The work continued, the fires were kept. Alice reconciled the Michaelmas rents against Greaves' falsified entries with a precision that was beginning to look less like assistance and more like mastery. Reverend Sumner came on a Tuesday with a sketch of the east face of the church roof and left it with Mrs. Peel, who placed it on the mantel in the library where the Duke would see it when he returned. He came back on a Friday, in the late afternoon, the carriage coming down the valley road through a pewter-coloured sky. Selina heard it from the library and did not go to the window. She threw out his step in the entrance hall, heard Mrs. Peel, heard the low exchange of voices. He came to the library. He was thinner than he had left, the thinness of a journey that had required something of him, and he had his hat still in his hand, which meant he had come directly through the house without stopping. He said, "She showed me his room. She still has it." Selina looked up at him. There were drawings on the desk. He used to draw, apparently. Birds. She had them in a folder. His voice was not broken. It was the voice of a man who had had the breaking and had been through the far side of it and was standing on the other shore. She was glad of the watch. She thanked me for coming. He was quiet for a moment. She said she had wondered. She knows now, Selina said. Yes. The watch was gone from his breast pocket. She did not say so. He did not need to. For 2 weeks after his return, the house at South Tarn was warmer than it had been at any point in the 10 years of its dereliction. Not merely in temperature, though the parlours were fired regularly now, and Reverend Sumner's roof had been commissioned, and Sowerby's barn was receiving its slates, but in some quality of the air that had less to do with heat than with the simple fact of a man who had resumed his life and was living it in the forward direction. And then, in the first week of February, the Duke grew formal. It came on gradually, the way cold comes on in the north, not a single overnight transformation, but a slow tightening, a lowering of the sky. He still came to the library, but he arrived later and left earlier. He took to addressing her as Miss Radham again, where he had begun, over the preceding weeks, to address her not at all. Their conversations having developed the particular shorthand of people who spend enough time together that prefatory forms become redundant. He asked, one evening, whether she had given any thought to the accounts needing attention after the spring tenancy renewals, and noted that the work of the library was largely complete. The damaged volumes assessed, the active damp addressed, the restorable books identified and set aside. He said it in the tone of a man delivering information, not having a conversation. She listened to all of it. "You are frightened again," she said. He looked at her. "You let me see the whole of you," she said. "You told me about Tim's, and you went south, and you came back, and the thing you had been carrying for 10 years was less heavy. And then you understood what had happened, that someone had seen you entirely, that nothing was concealed anymore, and it terrified you. So you are doing this, making it professional again, reducing it to accounts and schedules and employment. Because if you send me away before I have the chance to leave you, then you control the terms of the loss." The fire held the silence between them. "I will not be driven off," she said, "not by formality and not by the careful management of distance. You should know that now." She did not say she would stay. She did not say she loved him. But she did not move from her chair, and she did not look away, and the letter on the desk, now returned to its drawer, sent and its burden delivered, was not between them any more. Only the fire and the long quiet of the house, and the question she had not answered in the kitchen 3 weeks ago, still present, still open, waiting with the patience of a thing that knows it will eventually be answered. He came to the library in the 3rd week of February with the Natural History Survey of the Northern Fells in his hand, the small 1791 volume that had lived on the corner of the accounts desk for 2 months, displaced from its shelf and never returned because Selina had been reading it in fragments. He set it on the table between them, open to chapter 8, and she looked at the page and then at him. The chapter was titled simply, "The Tarn at South Tarn, a Description." The author had written, with the careful precision of a man who had sat on the northern shore of the water for a long time and wanted to get it right, that the Tarn was a body of water that had been, in geological terms, gradually turned toward the light, its northern shore, once forested, cleared in living memory, now open to sky in all weathers. He wrote that at midsummer the Tarn caught the last hour of evening sun and held it for perhaps 20 minutes before the fells put it out. He wrote that he had sat and watched this on 3 separate occasions and that it had not been the same twice. The Duke had a pencil mark in the margin beside this passage. She had not put it there. She looked up. "I have been reading ahead of you," he said, and she understood at once that they were not talking about the book. She set down her pencil. "You did not answer the question I asked in the kitchen," he said. He was very still. Not the studied stillness of the first weeks, when stillness had been a form of self-management, but the stillness of a man who has decided something and has come to the point of it. "I am asking it again, plainly. Not as an employer, not as a man who is frightened of the answer, as a man who wants his life to go in a particular direction, and who would like, if you are willing, for that direction to include you." The fire in the grate had burned down to a steady heat. Outside, the tarn was a pale sheet of morning light through the frost on the glass. "Yes," she said. "On one condition." He waited. "That you tell me something true every day. Not kind, true." She paused. "You have spent 10 years managing what people were allowed to see. I will not have a marriage built on managed distance. What you are thinking, the bad of it as well as the good, I want to hear it." "I can do that," he said. "I know you can," Selina said. "That is why I am saying yes." The wedding was in April, in the church whose east face lead had been replaced in February, the repaired slates still pale against the older stone. Reverend Sumner conducted the ceremony with the contained solemnity of a man who has presided over this rite many times and knows the difference between the occasions when the words are received as form and the occasions when they land with their full weight. Alice stood as witness, her square hands folded, her expression the expression of someone filing a piece of information that confirms a conclusion long since reached. Mrs. Peel wept in the second pew, in the quiet, alarmed way of a woman who has not wept in years and finds the experience unexpected. The morning was clear and cold, the valley still and bright, the tarn just visible between the south gate and the Lich Gate as a strip of pale silver in the distance. It was, as these things go, a small wedding. As these things go, it was the exact size it needed to be. London in May was a city Selina had not visited in 4 years, and the interval had not diminished it. The noise and the smell and the press of it were as she remembered. The streets full of the productive chaos of a capital operating at full spring season capacity. Curricles and coal carts and the private carriages of the great houses, all occupying the same narrow lanes with the same sublime mutual disregard. She watched it through the window of their carriage, with the attention of a woman cataloguing a territory she has not surveyed in some time, and is not certain she entirely trusts. The Duke had been silent since the last mile. Not the stiff silence of the winter, the silence of a man who is composing himself, voluntarily, for something he knows will require it. "They will stare," she said. "Yes," he said. "Not at me," she said, and her voice was steady and plain. "At you. You have been gone 10 years, and you are back, and they will not quite be able to reconcile the man who left with the man they are looking at, and they will look until they have managed it." "I know," he said. "Good," Selina said. "Let them look. You are not required to perform anything for them." The carriage turned onto Grosvenor Square. The house in London had been opened for the season, the holland covers removed by servants sent ahead, the rooms aired and arranged with the quick efficiency of a household that had not forgotten how to operate simply because its principal had chosen not to use it. It smelled of beeswax and the particular undertone of a building recently unshuttered, dust dispersed but not quite gone, Daylight admitted to rooms that had preferred the dark. The first caller was Sir Charles Ardell, who arrived the morning after they reached London and asked for the Duke in terms that suggested he had been informed of their arrival within hours of it. He was perhaps 50, square-shouldered in the way of a man who was once military and has not entirely stopped being military, with a face that had been candidly weathered and made no attempt to conceal it. He had served with the Duke in Spain, not in the same regiment, but in the same theatre, in the same campaigns, and he received Selina with a directness that was entirely different from the directness of Aldous Sarn. Where Sarn's directness had been social intelligence deployed as a weapon, Sir Charles was simply a man who preferred to look at things straight. "I have told everyone who asked that Dominic was in good health," he said to Selina, over the tea she poured in the front sitting room, "because it was the most useful thing I could say when I had no actual intelligence to offer. I hope it turns out to have been accurate." "Broadly," Selina said. Sir Charles looked at her, a look of assessment that was also, she thought, a look of relief. "Good," he said. "There are people here who will not be pleased. I expect you already know that." She said she expected she would find out. She found out 3 days later at a small assembly at Lady Fairfax's house in Berkeley Street, where the Seasons Company had gathered in the way of London society in full motion, drawing room to drawing room, the same faces in different arrangements. The intelligence of who was present and what they had said, moving through the rooms with the cheerful efficiency of a well-organised postal service. Lady Fairfax received them with perfect correctness, and several people came to pay their respects to the Duke with the particular quality of attention given to a man who has been away long enough for his return to constitute an event. Lady Augusta Kell was across the room when Selina first saw her. She was tall, fair, and wore her beauty with the ease of someone who has carried it long enough not to notice it. And she stood with 2 other women near the fireplace, in the attitude of a group that has been talking with the specific, focused attention that means the subject under discussion is not present. She looked at Selina with a clear, pleasant gaze, and her expression did not change in any way that a stranger would have caught. Selina caught it. Lady Augusta came to speak to them before the quarter hour was out, and she was gracious in precisely the way that requires no genuine warmth. She congratulated the Duke on his return, asked after South Tarn with the vague, interested tone of a person who finds the country decorative in the abstract, and spoke to Selina in the manner of a woman addressing a competent upper servant who has been unexpectedly elevated. Not rude, never rude, but with the slight surplus of pleasantness that is itself a form of condescension. She referred to Selina's work on the library as remarkable, with the particular emphasis that places a fact in quotation marks. The Duke answered for himself, and let Selina answer for herself. He did not perform at Lady Augusta's conversational cues, and Lady Augusta moved on, and the evening was entirely uneventful. It was only later, over the following week, that the rumour reached proper circulation. Selina heard the outer edges of it, a pause in a conversation when she entered a room, a sentence completed slightly too quickly. The precise formulation she learned from Sir Charles, who came to Grosvenor Square on the Thursday with the expression of a man delivering information he considers it his duty and his regret to convey. He told them both, sitting in the same front sitting room where they had first met, without preamble. Lady Augusta had been saying, in the drawing rooms and card parties that constituted the season's news service, that the new Duchess of Elmsford had been a paid housekeeper engaged to manage an invalid's affairs, that she had secured the marriage by making herself indispensable to a man too broken by the war to know when he was being managed, and that the whole affair was more to be pitied than censured, the last clause being the one designed to do the most damage, since pity is the form condescension takes when it wants to appear charitable. The Duke listened to this with his face still. Selina listened with her face still. Sir Charles finished and waited. "She is not wrong about the housekeeper," Selina said. "She is wrong about everything else," the Duke said. He stood. He went to the window and stood there for a moment looking down at the square. When he turned back, his expression had the quality she had come to know as decision arrived at. Not anger, not performance, but the quiet finality of a man who has identified the correct action and intends to take it. "All Max is Wednesday," he said. "I believe Lady Augusta will be there." Sir Charles said that she would. "Good," the Duke said. All Max on a Wednesday in May was the season at its most reliable. The assembly rooms full to their standard social density, the music from the upper floor coming down through the floorboards in the practical way of music in an old building. The company in its best clothes and its best manners, both items subject to a degree of wear by the evening's later hours. The vouchers had been secured by Lady Fairfax, who was a patroness, and who had made the arrangement with her usual brisk authority, pressing the cardboard squares into Selina's hand at their last visit, with the expression of a woman who considers herself not a patron of society, but an engineer of outcomes. They arrived at 9:30. The Duke was in dark coat and white cravat, the cravat tied with the particular precision of a man who has dressed for a thing he intends to see through. And Selina wore grey silk, not the working grey of her arrival at South Tarn, but a good grey. The grey of a woman who has chosen her colour and is not apologising for it. They descended from the carriage, and the footman at the door admitted them, and they went up the stairs into the light and the noise of the rooms. The Duke was looked at. She had told him they would, and they did. The particular quality of attention that moves across a room without quite arriving. The slight pause in conversation. The fractional reorientation of heads. He walked through it with his back straight and his face composed. And she walked beside him and did not perform anything. Lady Augusta was at the refreshment table when Selina went for lemonade, alone, in the interval between sets. She had come separately, which meant she had come to be seen rather than accompanied, and she occupied the refreshment table with the easy authority of a woman who has never had to negotiate for space in a room. The insult, when it came, was exactly the kind designed to require no wit to land, but considerable confidence to deliver. Quiet enough to maintain deniability, loud enough to reach the two women standing immediately adjacent. Lady Augusta observed, to no one in particular, as Selina reached for a glass, that it was remarkable how London had changed. One saw quite anyone at Almack's nowadays. She paused, and then added, in the same pleasant, carrying tone, that a woman who had been mending her own gowns not 12 months previous could hardly be expected to know the room. The two women near the table, one a baronet's wife, one a girl on her second season whose eyes had gone wide, were entirely still. Selina set down the glass she had just picked up. She was aware of the exact quality of the silence around her, the kind that forms when a public remark has been made and the room is deciding how to receive it. She was aware of Lady Augusta's face, composed, satisfied, wearing the expression of a woman who has just done something she considers necessary. She was aware of the baronet's wife beginning a small sideways movement, the physical language of a person deciding whether to involve herself. What Selina did not do: flush, leave, apologise, produce a cutting response, or perform dignity. She simply looked at Lady Augusta for a moment, with the level, unhurried gaze she had first trained on the Duke in a ruined library in November. And she said, quietly and without emphasis, "You have made your position clear, Lady Augusta. So has mine." She took the glass of lemonade and went back to the room. Sir Charles found her within 10 minutes. He had heard the acoustics of the refreshment room and the speed of social transmission between them, having done their work in less time than it takes to cross a dance floor. He had the expression of a man who is angry on behalf of someone who is not visibly angry herself, which he appeared to find both admirable and somewhat frustrating. "Where is Dominic?" he said. "He was speaking to a man from the club," Selina said. "Please don't tell him yet." Sir Charles looked at her. I mean that he should not act out of anger, she said. When he comes, let it be his choice, and let it be calm. Angry men make declarations. Calm men make records. Sir Charles considered this, and then gave a short nod that was as close to approval as his face appeared to come. The Duke came late to the main room. He had been in the card room, she learned afterward, with a colonel of his former acquaintance who had news from the peninsula, the kind of news that cannot be hurried. But Sir Charles had found him before he came in. Sir Charles had told him everything. Selina did not learn this immediately, but understood it at once from the quality of the Duke's stillness as he entered the room and found her position across the floor. He had heard, and he had made the same calculation she had made. Not anger, not the heat of a man responding to a provocation, but something deliberate. He crossed the room. He did not hurry. He crossed the full length of the floor through the company, and the company parted for him in the unconscious way of a crowd adjusting for a man who is moving with a specific purpose. And several people turned to watch because there is a particular quality of intention that is impossible to ignore in a crowded room. He came to her, and he took her hand, and he raised it and kissed the back of it. Not a quick social gesture, but the deliberate act of a man honouring something. And he did not look away from her face while he did it. The room had gone quiet in the radius around them. Then he turned. Lady Augusta was 10 feet away, near the edge of the floor. She had been watching him cross the room, and she had not moved, and her composure was entirely intact, except for a slight fixed quality around the eyes. The expression of a person who has made a calculation that is currently being revised. The Duke spoke without raising his voice. He did not require volume. The room's quiet carried him. My wife, he said, found a house in ruin, and a man who had decided the wreckage was his proper condition. She did not pity either of them. She went to work on both. He paused. I spent 10 years in the dark because I believed I had earned it. She told me plainly that I hadn't. And she was right. And I have no intention of forgetting either the fact or the source of it. He looked at Lady Augusta with the precise directness of a man who has stopped managing his expression for an audience. If anyone here believes that reflects poorly on her, they are questioning a judgment I will defend as a man of honour must. Lady Augusta's face was the face of a woman who has had the last word taken from her before she had fully committed to using it. No one spoke. The music from the upper floor had not stopped. It had continued throughout, the quadrille reaching its second figure with serene indifference to everything below it, and after a moment, conversation resumed in the room with the careful deliberateness of a company that has witnessed something and is deciding how to process it. Two men near the window began talking about horses. The baronet's wife from the refreshment room moved toward her husband. A girl on her second season leaned to whisper to the girl beside her, and both of them looked at Selina with expressions that were not unkind. Sir Charles materialised at the Duke's elbow with 2 glasses, and the expression of a man whose faith in a plan has been entirely vindicated. Lady Augusta was gone from the room within a quarter of an hour. Selina saw her leave without ceremony. A door, a footman, and then the space she had occupied simply being occupied by other people. They left London the same night. It was not a flight, nothing in their manner as they descended the Almack's stairs, or collected their carriage, or spoke to the driver, had the quality of retreat. It was more that, having done what they had come to do, the city had nothing further to recommend it. The season, with its timetable of assemblies and calls, and the elaborate social machinery of reputation management, had served its purpose. The Duke had returned, had been seen to return, had stood in the middle of the room he had been absent from for 10 years, and spoken plainly about what his life had become. And there was nothing further to demonstrate. The work was at South Tarn. The life was at South Tarn. They drove through the night, the London streets thinning after midnight to the working population of the city, bakers' boys and night soil men, and the women who sold coffee from braziers at the major crossings, all of them at their labour in the dark, with the cheerful indifference of people for whom the evening's entertainments at Almack's are a matter of perfect theoretical neutrality. Selina watched them from the carriage window, and the Duke slept beside her with his shoulder against hers, and the city fell away, mile by mile, into the flat south country, and then the slowly rising country of the Midlands, and by the time the sky began to lighten in the east, they were well north of Coventry, and the air through the window had a quality different from London air, cleaner and colder, and more itself. They were back at South Tarn by the end of the second day, the carriage descending the valley road as it had the first time, but different now, in every particular that mattered. The shutters were off the windows. The drive had been regraded. Selina had left that instruction with the head groom before they departed, and its edges were sharp and its gravel new. The 3 windows in the upper story that had been intact in November now had their companions. All the glass was in, and the light of the late afternoon was doing what light does in a house that has been open to it after long absence. Moving across the stone floors in long, warm panels and finding the surfaces that were worth finding. Mrs. Peel was at the door, her apron straight, and her expression the expression of a woman who has not wept since April and does not intend to start again. Alice was in the library. Selina could see the lamp in the window from the drive, working at 5:30 on a Friday, because Alice was Alice, and the tenancy renewals did not organise themselves. Reverend Sumner's letter of congratulations on their return was on the hall table, propped against the decanter, next to a small bunch of heather in a blue vase that had not been on the table when they left, and had therefore been placed there by someone who had wanted to mark the occasion without making a speech about it. Selina looked at the heather, and then at Mrs. Peel, who was looking somewhere slightly to the left of Selina's ear. "Thank you, Mrs. Peel," Selina said. "The library is warm," Mrs. Peel said, "and supper at 8, if that suits." It suited. The summer came early to the valley that year. By the second week of June, the fells had their full green, and the tarn, which had been dark all winter, metallic, still, a surface that kept its own counsel, changed its character entirely. Selina first noticed it on a morning in late June. The water had shifted from grey to blue-green, the colour of shallow water over pale rock, and the light moved across it in a way that made it look inhabited by something other than weather. The library was largely done by July. The north wall's worst casualties had been professionally attended to. A bookbinder from Penrith had come for a fortnight and worked with the respectful precision of a craftsman who takes damaged things seriously. And the remaining volumes stood straight on their shelves, the air between them dry and clean. The terrestrial globe still had its crack from pole to pole. Selina had decided in the end not to have it repaired. The meridian split had been there long enough to be part of the object's truth, and there was something she found, in her own practical way, worth keeping about a world that shows its damage while remaining whole and usable. The bookbinder had cleaned and stabilised the base, and the globe turned smoothly on its axis now, the continents traversing the room as they had been made to do. The weather lamb that Nan had caught in the kitchen garden was a small sheep by August, recognisable to the household by its complete lack of interest in the boundary between garden and pasture. It continued to come through the gap in the south wall with regular philosophical conviction, and the gap continued not to be repaired, because no one had quite been able to bring themselves to close it. It was an evening in late August, the sky still light past 8 o'clock in the way of northern summers, the fells amber and violet in the long lateral sun. When the Duke came to find Selina on the eastern bank of the Tarn, where she had taken to walking in the evenings, not a purposeful walk, not the walk of a woman with something to arrange, but the walk of a person who has somewhere she likes to be and goes there. He had been at the home farm with Sowerby's son-in-law, looking at a drainage question that had occupied 3 visits worth of discussion, and had finally arrived at a solution that satisfied both men's convictions about the correct direction for water to travel. He was in his working coat, and there was a streak of clay on his sleeve that had been there since the morning, and had survived the afternoon unaddressed. Because the afternoon had not produced an opportunity to address it, and it did not matter. Selina had the Natural History Survey in her hand, the small 1,791 volume that lived on the accounts desk in the library and travelled with her when she was not at the desk. She had been rereading the passage about the tarn at midsummer, the author's description of the 20 minutes when the evening light held the water gold. The way he had noted it 3 times and found it different each time. She had been watching it from the bank for perhaps half an hour, and the water was doing what the author had described. The low sun coming across the western fell and laying itself on the tarn's surface in a sheet of late gold, moving very slightly in the wind off the hill. The light not steady, but alive. She heard him come along the bank path, the grass wet enough from the morning that his steps were nearly silent, and she was aware of him standing beside her before she turned. "The author was right," she said, without looking at him, gesturing with the book toward the water. "About the 20 minutes? About it not being the same twice." He looked at the tarn, and then she said something, a remark about the natural historian's failure to account for midges as a feature of the midsummer tarn experience, and the degree to which this constituted a deliberate omission on the part of a man who had otherwise documented the valley with meticulous thoroughness. And he laughed. A full laugh, the kind that requires a moment to recover from, unguarded in the way she had learned was the truest register of his face. No management, no performance, just the sound of a man who has found something genuinely funny and is not moderating his response to it. She did not laugh with him. She watched him, the scar silver in the late light, his face open and entirely without the weight that had occupied it through the long winter, and the corners of her mouth lifted, just slightly, and she looked back at the water. The tarn held the gold for another 11 minutes. Then the fell put it out, and the water returned to its own quiet blue. And the 2 of them stood on the bank in the last of the evening, the book still in her hand, his clay-streaked sleeve just touching hers.